And those growth gains have been productivity gains by technology, genetics, and other things like that, and not by using more cropland or having more livestock. So I like to just kind of start with a positive thing about, agriculture has come a long way for a lot of reasons. And that's something in my eyes, it's something to celebrate. Oops. Okay. So also some level setting on U.S. greenhouse gas emissions by sector. So you can see that transportation industry and electric power dominate most of the greenhouse gas emissions. And so that makes sense in the emphasis we see these days on EVs and renewables or renewable natural gas and things like that. Agriculture, I believe, actually is just under 10%. So I like to point this out, one, just to show context to the United States. It's also important to know that, agriculture as a global entity is somewhere around 30% of greenhouse gas emissions. So the U.S. has a good efficiency, like we saw that on that previous slide, a good efficiency story to tell. They're only at 10% of greenhouse gas emissions. And looking at sort of the sources and sinks, so where do greenhouse gas emissions come from? And then what is the opportunity to, especially for carbon, we're one of the few industries that can naturally sequester carbon. So the top greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture are actually mainly nitrous oxide and methane. And so a lot of times we hear about carbon dioxide as sort of the poster child when we think about greenhouse gases, but actually a little bit different for agriculture. And so for the methane, this mainly comes from enteric fermentation, or sort of that ruminant digestive system with cow burps, and then also manure management. And then nitrous oxide is mainly soil management. Soil management, nitrous oxide is a very tricky greenhouse gas because there's natural releases of greenhouse gases. There's obviously from fertilizer and things like that. It really is dependent on your soil type and your climate type and all these different things that go into, what do those emissions look like? Obviously, we don't really grow rice in Michigan, so that's not a big one for methane for us. And then you can see some of the other ones. You see we can sequester if we are planting cover crops, conservation, or reduced tillage, putting in soil amendments that can help sequester carbon. And then obviously we have this cycle of photosynthesis that is already naturally producing carbon, especially you think about some of our amazing fruit crops in the state. Also, they're literally planting trees to grow delicious fruit for us. So that's just a little bit of background. What's the why? So I've given this presentation, I've lost track to be honest. And it changes every time I give that. So keep that in mind if you're watching this recording after the fact. This changes on a regular basis from what the private sector is doing, what the government is doing, what Michigan is doing. And so keep that in mind. But the reason that we see the increase in popularity in talking about carbon programs and things like that is that the private sector has been pushing for some of these to meet their greenhouse gas initiative goals. You can see Pizza Hut, Kellogg, Cargill, Pepsi, and Walmart. And we'll get into sort of the naming convention and things like that. But there's a lot of companies pushing to meet some of their sustainability goals and climate goals, and they're doing it in a variety of ways. And so there's been a lot of conversation, and that's why I think some of these carbon programs have popped up as being popular and being stood up because they see the demand in the marketplace, not necessarily mandates from government, but also just from that private sector. And then I have a couple of buts. So there's a lot going on in this chart, but this is talking about the voluntary carbon market transactions. And so if we go down, we can see, so it shows 22 and 2023. We've increased the volume of agricultural voluntary carbon credits, but the price has decreased a lot, which is not great news for farmers who want to participate. But then we also see, let's see if I can do this. There we go. On sort of the demand side, there's been a lot of conversations of how do we create carbon credits that, especially, Farm Bureau looking at agriculture that, the demand side can trust, as this is a actual reduction or avoidance in greenhouse gas emissions. And so there's a lot of conversation, and I will even bring that up too, about the transparency in the programs, what farmers should be asking questions, because frankly, there isn't a lot of transparency in these programs and in the market. And so how do we, continue to build the trust and quality so that, farmers have access to something that makes sense for them and is a quality program. So there's that one. And then also, this is a little bit out of date, but frankly, I think that is still accurate, is that there's a very low number of people I have seen, generally like 1 to 4%, as I keep monitoring this. Very low participation. Some are interested in monitoring. Some don't think it's a great program for farmers. There's better financial opportunities and things like that. So this is something that I think is not necessarily, it's been around for a little bit now. I think for the past 4 years as I've been kind of learning and we've been going through, but I think there's still very much thinking long term in developmental mode right now. So I think that things are going to continue to change as the landscape changes, as the politics change, as the regulations may or may not change. I think we'll still continue to see the ones that stick around in the long term are going to continue to try and evolve to make sense for farmer programming. Oop. Okay. So transitioning to some common terms that I may use or you may hear if you do further research. So carbon dioxide equivalent is basically converting the other greenhouse gases, so nitrous oxide and methane, which are more efficient warmers of the atmosphere than carbon dioxide is, into sort of a base, so that everything is either in carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalent, so you can do math easier, so you're not using different units. A carbon credit is generally equal to 1 metric ton of carbon sequestered, or 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions avoided. So if we think about to kind of do both ends, if we implement cover crops and no-till and we sequester a metric ton of carbon, that would be a carbon credit. If we implement, say we put a anaerobic digester on a livestock operation and they capture so many tons of methane that doesn't get released, then you would translate that into however many carbon dioxide equivalents in methane. Ecosystem services, so this one is not as flashy as the carbon conversation, but in addition to programs looking at carbon and greenhouse gases, there's also been some ones that are looking at credits for water quality improvements, which we see. We'll talk a little bit about practices and things like that, but we see a lot of practices that overlap and provide water quality improvements, some biodiversity and some habitats. We're not always as concerned, but water quantity. So are there practices that are maximizing the efficiency of your irrigation, for example? So there's a lot of different things. And so the interesting thing about ecosystem services coming into this equation is that there may be an opportunity for benefits to be stacked. So if I can sell a carbon credit and a water quality credit and a biodiversity credit, that might help increase my revenue more than just selling a carbon credit. So this is not every program, so it's just something that you'll have to keep an lookout for, and that is definitely, I think, even more of an emerging space than carbon credits are. Additionality is sort of the dirty word in carbon programs, is that in order to participate in programs, you generally have to have a new or changed practice. A changed practice could be if I have cover crops on my farm, but I'm using just a cereal rye and I move to a multi-species cover crop. That can count as a change practice. And so this will vary by program and opportunity. But keep that in mind, is that it's not as sometimes people are like, well, I'm already doing cover crops, so I can't participate. A lot of times it could be reducing an additional pass. It could be doing things, tweaking what you're doing to add that additional benefit. So keep that in mind. And I will cut off this question early on, is that right now the return on investment is not worth it for you to tear up a practice you've been doing for 20 years to be able to participate in the program. Just from my point of view, that just what you would need, what you're benefiting from doing that practice, and then what you would need to invest in to return to a previous practice. I don't think is what anybody wants, to be honest. Permanence, this becomes a big conversation in contracting, and we'll talk about, but basically, how long does especially in carbon sequestration, how long does something have to be sequestered in the soil to qualify for that carbon credit? And that's part of, if we go back to that quality discussion, how do we know what's quality and that's like sequestered, and how long is that sequestered for? Leakage is a little bit of a nuanced conversation. So wanting to make sure that if you're implementing a practice that's not causing, that is meant to decrease emissions, that it's not changing something else outside of that process that would increase emissions. So trying to make sure on the whole, if you look kind of being outside, say it's cover crops, that you're not actually increasing emissions by implementing a practice. A little squishy in how you how you enforce that, but that is a conversation that's had a lot. Sequestration, excuse me, is when we're storing soil or storing carbon in the soil. So carbon sequestration, and then on the flip side is sort of non-carbon, generally for agriculture, if we think about avoidance or reduction in nitrous oxide or methane emissions. So if we're able to capture methane from manure management, or now we have a feed additive that is reducing enteric fermentation emissions. So things like that are generally talked about in that way. Mitigation and resilience are also two words that are tossed a lot around in the climate space. Mitigation is basically the purpose of the carbon credit. You're either sequestering carbon or reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And then on the flip side of that is resilience. So as we see more extreme weather events or other impacts, pest movement and things like that, how are people adapting sort of to the new normal that is slowly changing as we move forward? And that's also commonly referred to as adaptation. Oops, I spoiled it. Okay, so we're just going to leave it like that. So there's a lot of terminology and buzzwords that get used, some more frequently than others. So we have net zero, carbon farming, soil health, climate smart, regenerative ag, and things like that. I am going to basically say conservation practices because there's a lot of overlap, and frankly, at the end of the day, what we're generally doing is implementing a conservation practice. I do have an asterisk on that though, because while for today I'm going to use conservation just so I'm not bouncing around, I'll try not to bounce around to buzzwords as much. If you're participating in a program, I would urge you to understand if they are a regenerative ag program or a climate smart program. What does that mean for that program and what you have to do on your farm? Because that's where kind of the rubber meets the road, is not in, what I say or what's in press releases, is understanding like what they mean when they mean regenerative. What does that mean especially when you're signing the contract? So keep that in mind. Is, yes, I like to cut through the noise because I really just want you to understand kind of the basics of what questions to ask, but it is important to understand what the program means when they say that. So how many changes you need to make on your farm, what is the long-term, things like that. Because I know a lot of, like, for example, regenerative ag is sort of that continuous improvement piece. So keep in mind, like, cutting through the noise for you all, but it's important to know what the context is for programs. Also want to touch on the scopes of emissions. So some of you all may remember the Securities and Exchange Commission regulations that had to do with reporting on the different scopes of emissions. Generally, agriculture fits into that scope 3 or supply chain emissions. So, if we are growing a product that then gets sent to a co-op that then gets sold to General Mills or goes into Ben and Jerry's. So that's all sort of that supply chain emissions, and that's what a lot of these bigger companies, when they implement soil health or regenerative ag programs, they are trying to get at those scope 3 emissions, because a majority of the time, Kellogg's doesn't own or control all of the grain farmers they purchase from. And so, how they're trying to get a handle on, okay, people are looking at me to make goals around my supply chain emissions that I don't control. So how can I address those in different programs? And so I'll give you an example of this, because there's a couple of, the carbon offsets and insets and carbon programs. There's a lot of those that go through like third parties. So if you think about the Indigo Ag, Corteva, there's a lot of folks in those spaces that have carbon credit programs that they may sell to a different entity. So you see like Microsoft up there. But then there's also programs where, like I said earlier, that those companies are working within their supply chain. So if a Kellogg's offers a program to what they call like their supply shed, so where they source a lot of their certain type of grain from, they may then claim whatever benefits of, if they're implementing cover crops or other practices, and associate it with that grain. So if you have a third party program and Cargill is buying your grain, the grain would still go to Cargill and it's just normal grain, and then Microsoft could buy your carbon offsets. And so with a carbon inset, that environmental attribute travels to that company or whatever the agreement is. So that looks a little bit different. And I know there's been programs that look to provide a premium for that. So you've implemented practice to get down to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions or sequester carbon. But that is a very large variable, and maybe depending on who you're working at, if you get cost share, things like that. So keep in mind, as companies continue to try and figure out what they're looking for in some of these scope 3 emissions goals, they're also influencing what, as a farmer, you may be offered or be able to participate in as well. It's not just a straight carbon offset that goes to Microsoft or GM or Fords of the world. Sometimes that could be really contained within your supply chain. So actually, this is a little bit of a Michigan example with what is an inset versus an offset. So the Air League crackers, one of the products that is in the Air League crackers, I think it was the oats. They tracked, they had to meet a certain carbon intensity score for those oats to be able to sell, to be made in this cracker, so that Air League could then make this claim on their box to say, hey, because we tracked everything from every commodity and accounted for what happens for end of life, if it gets shipped out through Amazon or if people buy it at a store, what does that mean? And so they tracked all of these things to make sure they could say, hey, your box of Air League means that 22 grams of carbon dioxide were removed from the air. So that is something where, those environmental attributes were tracked at the field scale, traveled with that commodity. Those commodities were sequestered from other commodities, so then they can make that environmental claim. And then offsetting, just to, on the flip side, is that, Indigo is a program. Indigo works with farmers to sign a contract, implement the practices, and then estimate and sell the carbon credits. Those carbon credits then go to a Microsoft, and then, then the farmer can sell the grain or product to whoever. So we're going to go over the basics, and keep in mind these are questions you could ask of basically any program. I don't name programs specifically out just because things are changing so frequently. And I also don't want to give the idea of endorsement or not endorsing certain programs. So this is just high level educational to think about what might be best for you in your operation. So there's limited government intervention in programs right now that are being offered to farmers, and with the election, I would expect that to continue. And this is mainly being led by the private sector and nonprofit programs. So one, it's voluntary. So if at the end of this conversation you're like, Tess, I hate everything about this, I don't want to do it, I can be like, great, you do not have to. So this is generally thing. If it is with a private program, that might be a little bit of a different conversation depending on how the companies are approaching that. And I will talk a little bit about that later. But keep in mind, if you're going for like the third party route through like those Indigos or whoever's of the world, that is a voluntary thing. Indigo can't make you sign up to sell a carbon credit. Programs are very different across the spectrum, and this has been a constant trend. What practices are available for implementation vary greatly by the program. Some are like, you get these 3 practices and that's it. Others have a lot of more variety. Availability. So you may hear, about a popular program, but it may not be available in Michigan. I know there's been programs that have grown and then are starting to be available in Michigan. It might not be available in all parts of Michigan. So keep that in mind when you're researching, making sure that if you want to participate in a program, that it is available in your county for your commodity in Michigan. And so there have been strides made, but really a lot of the focus around carbon credit programs has been on row crops, where we have a lot of data on carbon dioxide emissions and sequestration and emissions avoidance. There's been a couple who are programs that have popped up that are more dedicated to livestock, especially with a new feed additive on the market that reduces enteric fermentation. A lot of our specialty crop growers, even though, for example, you think about orchards and things like that literally grow trees, trying to understand those, there's not a lot available for those folks. And I think that I'll touch on a little bit later. Hopefully, maybe we can get that to change. And again, constantly evolving. So normally I make a bigger disclaimer, but you could see me again in 6 months and say, Tess, you said this, but it's not like that. It could have changed. It is constantly evolving, changing, depending on a variety of factors. And at the end of the day, contracts are king, data is queen, meaning I will spend a lot of time talking about contracts because no matter what is on their website, is in their marketing, what the salesperson tells you, that contract is going to govern what happens in a variety of scenarios that you may face if you're implementing conservation on the farm. And then also data is hugely important, and still, and something I'll touch on later is, you're going to need a lot of data to be able to enter these programs. They want to know all the things about the land that you're working on. And so that's going to be another thing about any program is, what data do they require and all this other good stuff. But we'll talk about that. But those are, from my perspective, the 2 biggest things when approaching programs or carbon programs or anything like that. So what practices earn credits? These are kind of the main ones that I find if you kind of go look through the different programs. And thankfully, I'm glad Danny mentioned that you are having a forestry carbon credit one, because those are kind of a whole different ball game just because of how they're set up. So I would encourage you to join that webinar, because I'm not going to touch as much on that. But so cover crops and reduced tillage and no-till are kind of the most popular ones. You're the ones you'll hear me use these examples the most. Manure management, that can be a different, ball game depending on, there's other things like low carbon fuel standards or other renewable natural gas credits that are involved in that. Nutrient management, diversifying crop rotations, grazing management. And then I also think that, I've seen folks continuing to add options for different practices you can use. So some of it, I know there's a lot of talk about nitrogen efficiency or reduction programs, different soil amendments. And so again, that really is going to be dependent on what program you're a part of and what commodity you grow and all of that good stuff. So you'll hear me say, if you have questions, it'll be like, well, it depends. And I kind of sound like a crazy person, but it's because that there's so much nuance. And frankly, lack of transparency in the marketplace, it's sometimes hard to say, yes, this is the answer. So keep that in mind, that it keeps changing, adding, all of that good stuff. So when I talk through these, I like to put these considerations into three different buckets. So agronomic, so what does it take to implement the conservation practice? Financial, I do like to fold the financial piece out, even though it's in the contract, just because there's some nuance there I like to cover. And then contractual piece as well. So agronomic considerations, and so I think these are what I see a couple of technicians on here. So what they might talk to you about and what you might ask questions about is this practice a good fit for your operation? And frankly, I think that you can see the quality of the program you're engaging with if they help you figure that question out. Because if they're trying to sell a quality carbon credit, they do not want you to fail at the conservation practice. So you're just like, I thought, if they're like, I'm not sure if this will work, and then they should be like, okay, like let's not do that, but like, is this an option instead? Just understanding that like you want to be successful if you're gonna go through this program. And with that, does the program offer you technical support to implement a practice? So there are some companies, for example, that I've seen that offer agronomic support when you're implementing a practice. So they can help you if you've never done cover crops before. They may offer you some assistance through their company to figure out if you have to pay for that. But that's a nice sort of option to have that expertise available if you're implementing a new practice. And then it can also be technical support if you have local technical support that can also help you with that. And then do you need inputs or equipment or other things to implement your new practice, and can you get a hold of them in time? So I know I think less so now, but in the years I've been giving this presentation, we've gone through a lot of supply chain disruptions. So making sure you can get your cover crop seeds. If you need any crop protectants that you need to implement a practice, do you need any sort of new tillage equipment? If you're going to strip till or anything like that. So make sure that, you can, have the knowledge you need to be successful, but also have the tools you need to actually implement the practice. So financial considerations, what are you getting paid? So what is the rate? Are you getting paid per acre per practice? So for example, a program says, I will pay you $10 an acre to implement cover crops, or is it, I will pay you $15 per carbon credit? So the reason why this makes a difference is that carbon sequestration, similar to how I mentioned nitrous oxide, can vary greatly depending on your soil type, depending on your climate, depending on what you're doing, and all there's et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of times your rate of carbon sequestration, so back to our terminology, your carbon credit is equal to 1 metric ton of sequestered carbon. So if we just look at the sequestered carbon for right now, I would say the average of the tools I've played around with that is about a half a ton of carbon sequestered per acre. So keep in mind, so if that's like the kind of average, so again, it can be less or more depending on all the factors that go into what does your soil look like and all of those good things. You, on average, may be sequestering about a half a ton of carbon in your soil per acre. So if we're looking at a carbon credit that is you're being sold by carbon credit, keep in mind that if you're being paid $15 per carbon credit, that's $7.50 per acre. So that matters when you're penciling out, okay, does this make sense to me to participate? Does this change? So everyone's been speculating for years on if the carbon credit prices will go up or down or things like that. And so especially if it goes up, does your contract allow the company to share some of that increased revenue with you through your contract? On the flip side, can they decrease the price if the prices continue to fall? What are you getting paid also refers to what is the financial incentive? Are you just getting a check? Are you getting cryptocurrency? And I know nothing about cryptocurrency except there's at least one program that pays out cryptocurrency. So if you are like me and that scares you, just be aware. Some allow discounts on their products if you participate in their carbon programs and other things like that. So keep that in mind. what sort of financial tool are you getting paid in if it's not just straight dollars. Um, I also have an asterisk there, and I just say have take a critical eye when you're reading or listening to other farmer testimonials, because I know I was listening to a webinar and this farmer was like, "Oh yeah, I got like 6 figures in carbon credit programs," and I was like, "That is a lot of money." But then it comes out later that he put 2,000 acres in a program, and so there you have economies of scale. So just think about if you hear someone saying, "Oh, you can make this much money," what is the scale? Because some programs do have acreage minimums, but some of those minimums are fairly small. So if you're putting in 100 acres to a program, that's a lot different, and your balance sheet's going to look a lot different than if you're putting 2,000 acres in a program. When are you getting paid? Is it annually? Is it the end of the contract? Is there anything up front? So some programs may offer like a signing bonus of sorts, and some of them offer that to help you input all of your data as well, because that can be a big lift. What are other costs to participate? So obviously there's generally a cost to implement the practice, depending on what you're already doing on your operation. But some may say, hey, you have to use this subscription service to collect all your data and put all your information, or you have to use this specific product to achieve the results we're looking for. So keep that in mind. That will also, again, if you're balancing out, okay, what is the profitability of participating in this program, the time everything takes, the cost of the practice, and then, if I have to purchase anything else that I wasn't expecting, keep in mind when you're trying to figure out what your profit is and what your margins look like for the programs. Are you able to get other cost share dollars? So I haven't figured out the pattern. Some programs allow you to be part of a carbon program and also get cost share dollars from USDA. I will put the caveat on there. If it's a USDA funded climate smart commodity programs, you cannot be part of a carbon program on those same acres. But there's also some privately run carbon programs that do not allow that. And I haven't been able to figure out what the pattern is, but if you're looking to be able to use some cost share dollars, make sure that you are evaluating and reading your contract to understand if you are allowed to use those in tandem or if you are not, just so that you don't end up in trouble either way, especially if it's considered a breach contract. So I'm not a lawyer. I have gotten the opportunity to read a lot of these credit contracts, and I also, in a past life when I worked in the energy industry, also reviewed a lot of contracts. So this is more of you probably should go ask a lawyer to look at these, because some of them have some very interesting clauses, but also this is not legal advice. This is just, hey, maybe some questions to ask yourself on what you want your contract to look like. So an obvious one, but one that gets talked about a lot, is a length of a contract. So I think you'll probably hear in the forestry sector, there used to be, and there still are, contracts you could sign for like 100 years. I haven't seen any of that long in the ag sector yet, but keep in mind, like, if there might be like a 10-year contract out there, and is that something that makes sense for your operation? How long do you have to keep doing the practice? So you may think, Tess, if I have a 5-year contract, I do the practice for 5 years, and then like it's not up to them what I do. There have been some cases where we've seen language that says, here's the contract, it's 5 years long, we'll pay you for 5 years, but there's also a maintenance period, or thinking about a permanence clause that we talked about, like how long does that carbon have to be sequestered? And so then that contract may say, okay, and then I agree to continuing his practice for 5 years after the contract ends, generally without reimbursement, to sort of maintain that carbon stored in the soil. So again, keep that in mind. It's not every contract, it's not every program. The contracts are changing too, like that's just contracts have changed from year to year. And then, so keep that in mind. Force majeure. So force majeure is roughly like act of God. So a lot of times if you think about the energy industry, if there's a natural disaster that just takes down infrastructure or there's a sabotage of a pipeline, that's not something the energy industry can control. So similar in agriculture, unless you are hiding secrets from me, we can't control the weather. So what happens if you're in a situation where there is a drought, your field is, or on the flip side, your field is underwater? We had a situation where, you think about the Midland dams that failed. There's a lot of situations that are outside of our control in agriculture. So what happens if that happens? Do you have to pay back money you've already gotten? Can you continue? I know there's at least one program out there that will pause the program for that year and then you just try again next year when, bad things aren't happening. So keep that in mind. Sale of credits, understanding how involved or uninvolved you may want to be with your sale of credits. There are a couple of programs that allow you to set pricing and do other things. Others are saying, nope, you're just selling, like you basically give me stewardship of those and I will bundle those and sell those and then you just get the money back. So again, that could be a personal preference on how much how big of a hand you want to have in those sales. So again, any additional requirements that may be involved, whether that's a subscription, it's a product use, if there's any other reporting requirements, transfer of contract. So I know succession planning is important and we want to keep farms going for the next generation. So understanding what it might take if you either are selling property, because again, the carbon contract is linked to you, but it's also linked to that piece of land. So in order to maintain quality carbon credits, the market does not want multiple carbon contracts on the same piece of land. So understanding what it takes if you're selling the land, what does that mean? If you are transferring the contract to the next generation, how easy or hard is that, and what process do you have to go through? And then also, so just those two. So keep in mind if you know that there's going to be changes to your operations, that you'll want to know what the transfer looks like. Termination and renewal. So kind of on the flip, two sides of the same coin. Say you're like 2 years into a contract and you're like, I hate working with this program. This is not working for me. I want to do something different. What does it take to terminate the contract? And generally, especially if there's a cost with terminating the contract, you'll want to know if you have to pay money back or things like that. On the flip side, if you're like, I love this program, it's amazing, they're super supportive, I want to do another contract, how do you facilitate an easy renewal? So now going into the data piece, so measurement, reporting, and verification, or if you want an acronym, a lot of times it's MMRV, which is measuring, monitoring, reporting, and verification. So basically, how do they know, how does a program know what is being sequestered or emissions being avoided? And this really depends on the program that you are part of, because some companies will come take soil samples and then sort of put that into their model to calibrate their model to your soil samples. But there's also conversation around, are we actually making a climate benefit if we have to drive around the entire countryside to take all of these soil samples all of the time? So how do we maybe marry the models and other types of science to make this a more efficient process for everyone involved? Verification piece, understand what sort of access in the contract that you're giving to this program or to a third-party verifier. So one, knowing third-party verification, if that's happening, who's paying for it, but then also what sort of access do they have to your property, how much notice do they have to give, and things like that. Continuing along that same route, data collection, privacy sharing, etc. Again, if you want to be in this program, any of these programs, they're going to require a lot of data collection. So that keeps that in mind. And so I tell folks, even if you're not looking to participate in this carbon program or that climate smart program or whatever, if you think that might be an opportunity for your operation, make sure that you get your data house in order, which sounds weird, but because all of these programs are going to want data about, fertilization, what type of crops, what's your rotation, and all of these, there's a huge list of things that they're going to want to know. And so if you can get that ready before you're on a deadline to implement a program, that'll help you hate the process less, hopefully, if you have all of your data in order. Who's collecting your data, where is it stored, how private is it? So for example, if I, on my imaginary farm, am the only person participating in a carbon program in Michigan, are they going to still report that, hey, this is our participation? And then it's like, well, this is then my information all over the internet. Or are they doing things like how NAS, if you look at any of their reports, sometimes they will not share data if it makes it easy to identify a single operation's information. So again, know who has your data, who gets your data, who can they share your data with, and all of that good stuff. Rented land. If you have rented land, this is again varies between programs. So some contracts will make the landowner actually sign it, or have you show proof that you are able to farm this land for the length of the contract. So whether that's a formal agreement with you and the landowner and things like that, that really varies depending on the program. So again, your contract should lay out if you have rented land, either you can't participate in the program, or at least the rented land can't, or the landowner has to sign the contract, or you have to have a formal agreement in place with the landowner to be able to do that. Okay. Yep. So getting towards the end, I think some wild cards in the coming years are going to be regenerative ag programs. So these seem to be increasing in volume, especially in the US. So folks are looking at things like cover crops, reduced tillage, nutrient management, and how they can, again, incentivize those things within their supply chains in order to meet those scope 3 emission goals. So many of these companies have stated sustainability goals, whether that's around water, it's around implementation of cover crops, around reducing their scope 3 emissions. And again, for food companies, that can be up to 90% of their emissions comes from their supply chain, which isn't just agriculture, but you think about the Walmart of the world, they're not out there producing everything that they sell. So, but sometimes can be like up to 90% of their emissions. So they're looking at how do we incentivize that? And I think that, that is something that we're going to see more and more often, and we've already started to see more and more often. Partnerships for climate smart commodities. So if you remember a few years ago, there was about $3.1 billion distributed across the country for climate smart commodities projects, with the idea of trying to figure out what is a climate smart commodity and how do we help farmers market them. So is there a way to create sort of this middle of the road marketplace that's different from conventional, but also not organic, to say, hey, like a farmer should get a premium on this product because they implemented practices that, whatever slew of conservation practices or other practices on their operation that makes this have sort of a positive environmental quality associated with it. And so those are most of those are 5-year projects. And so I know there's a couple in Michigan that are 1 or 2 years in. So we still have some time before we see that. And so we'll see, kind of those lessons learned. And there's also a very heavy piece of data collection on those projects. So I will also be curious, as I like to nerd out a little bit with data, will we learn on like what climate smart actually means and what does it look like? Because there's climate smart commodity projects and everything from, beef to dairy to some of our row crops, some of our specialty crops. So what are we going to learn data wise, and how can that help support programs for a larger variety of producers? Tax credits. So you may have seen, if you're following ag media, there's a lot of scuttlebutt about when will the 45Z tax credits, which is for renewable fuels, and then that includes sustainable aviation fuels, when will that guidance be released by the IRS and USDA and all of that good stuff? And so that could also play a role, especially mainly for our row crops who can sell into those markets. What does that mean for, what incentives will be available? How does that work? If you remember earlier this year, the 40B guidance was released for sustainable aviation fuel, and it was kind of a flop. One, because the tax credit was basically for this growing year, but they didn't release the guidance until like May 1st. So at that point, most of us had probably already made a lot of our decisions and or planted. And so that was just really, I don't think, a highly utilized credit, just because there weren't that many folks that fit the criteria. If you happen to fit the criteria, it's more okay, it was luck versus I actually plan to be able to take advantage of this tax credit. So I think that also might sort of skew the conversation, especially for our row crop folks, on what does that mean? What is the value to the producer if I implement whatever that looks like? I think that'll be another opportunity for, depending on how well it's crafted, another opportunity for row crops to consider. So lastly, I would say that we had an election, and I think with this new, administration coming in, is that the private sector is going to be the main driver of climate and sustainability goals. And this is something I was at the Sustainable Ag Summit back in November, and this was the kind of the echo that I heard from there are a lot of large multinational companies there, and they said, we can't just change our strategy on the ball every administration. And so they're still going to be, and they still have these commitments out there. So they're still going to be working on their programs to see how they can support meeting their scope 3 emission goals or sustainability goals, whatever they want to call them. And so I think that will continue to evolve, and you'll continue to see notices. For example, the Bell Group up in a little bit in your neck of the woods is doing a regenerative ag pilot with apple growers to see, implementing those practices and setting results and trying to see how they can support growers in that space. I think there's going to be the data piece is very thorny issue, especially when you look at a diverse state like Michigan, is that the data collection and what we know about just generally about greenhouse gas emissions and when it comes to different agricultural crops is there's a huge variety of what we know, how reliable is the data, and things like that. And then also reducing supply chain emissions, is it a collaborative effort? So does a food company come to their growers and say, hey, like, these are our goals and these are the cost share agronomy tools or whatever else that you may need to help help us reach those goals? Or is it you shall do these things and that's all I'm giving you if you want to sell to us? So what does that conversation look like? What kind of, again, like data requirements? Because I know there's a lot of in the processing world or like the milling world, there's a lot of conversation of like, can we just please pick one program and one measuring stick to use, because you want one thing, that other person wants something else, and like it just creates a lot of duplication in the middle of folks trying to implement and like deliver on these goals. So how do we have an ongoing conversation of how to make things easier? And then obviously the specialty crop inclusion, I already talked about the Bell Group and the Go-Go Squeeze folks looking at their apple producers, but how do we ensure that our specialty crops are not left behind in this conversation, and also understanding that things might look a little different for different specialty crops because of just the diversity of growing methods and growing regions. And we think about integrated pest management, or IPM, is going to depend on a lot of different things. So how do we make sure that we're creating things for all of agriculture? And I think that's all I have. There's my contact information. Feel free to reach out. And I think we have time for questions if I am not out of line, Danny.
No, that's great. Thanks, Tess. So folks, if you have questions, you can go to the bottom of the screen and maybe drop those in the chat as we kind of wrap up here, and I'll try to filter those out for Tess, and then we can, if you got a big question, maybe just put that in, we can have you unmute and try to hash that out. So I think we'll just give that a second and see what we might have. or any questions at the library? Nothing from the folks here at the library anyway. And Tess, you mentioned you had, you've seen a lot of those contracts. So in the future, I don't know how many people on the webinar today are actively looking into this or thinking about this on their farm, but if they do have questions, you mentioned maybe go to a lawyer. Is there a resource like you at Farm Bureau or somebody too to go to or a place to look for more information and guidance on things to think about?
So I'll put this link in the chat, but Michigan Farm Bureau actually has a climate resource page that we have developed over the course of the few years. And one of the things on there is a FAQ, and I created that with one of our legal counsels to help kind of marry the what I see and then also kind of her legal knowledge of some of the terms and conditions to look for. And if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. But obviously it's not legal advice. I will just be like, hey, do we think, this is something that's going to work for you or the things like that. So I'm still happy to answer questions, just understanding that I'm not a lawyer by choice.
Yep, sounds good. All right, well, I'm not seeing any questions or any hand waving going on, so I think we'll maybe leave it at there, but Tess has her phone number and email up on the screen, so if anybody wants to try to check in on the future there, we can do that. I just want to thank you again, Tess, for having taken the time today to join us and kick off our webinar series and share what you do. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Hope you rest of your webinar series goes well.
Yeah, and so for that, for the folks listening, we do have about 3 more in our webinar series. This was our first one. And so as I mentioned at the beginning, through Mason Lake Conservation District, we'll have the 3rd Wednesday of the month doing our winter webinar series on emerging conservation topics. So next month will be family forest carbon. We'll be joined by Brittany Vanderwall and kind of the same idea, carbon markets, but on forested property. And we'll learn a little more about her program, and our forester Josh Shields will be on that as well. And he'll chime in with kind of some local things to think about on your own property and how that all comes into play. But for today, we'll call it good. I will have most of this recorded. Sorry, Tess, I didn't quite hit the start button at the very beginning, so we don't have your first slide. But the rest is recorded.